Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
It is a privilege to be here. The Vidhi Center for Legal Policy's two previous annual lectures were by Justice Chiraneshwar and Justice Rumapal, and that makes this invitation a very special honor. My thanks to our guest Gautam and his team at Vidhi. My topic today is a difficult one. I have attempted to shape it as best I could, but there is at least one thing I cannot and will not be doing. Reciting which judgment of which court of how many judges said what. Even if time permitted it, which it does not, and while it is the stuff of much entertainment for judges and lawyers, I imagine most would find it very dull indeed. History, culture, art, liberty, constitutional rights and freedoms, in a word, everything that defines us, or should define us, are among the most fundamental issues that affect any body politic. These should be the subject of constant grappling and continued discourse. Not only is the space for this kind of discourse shrinking in this country, but, and perhaps more troubling, the discourse itself is increasingly regarded as irrelevant. It is not. The general term discourse can indicate a limitless palette. In any truly civil society, it means a dialogue, an exchange, a conversation. A meaningful discourse has two or three essential requirements. First, it must be civil. As Justice Chandrachud wrote in a judgment delivered when he was a judge of the Bombay High Court, the discourse of law is the discourse of civility. This is true of every discourse and every conversation. But increasingly, expressions and outpourings of anger, venom, and vitriol, both in speech and in writing, seem to have edged out all semblance of discourse. We do not have conversations. We have tirades and shouting matches, and I do not have to tell you where you can most regularly view them night after night. As William Davies writes in Nervous States, Democracy and the Decline of Reason, the requirement or mandate of civility in discourse, especially scientific discourse, is well established. It was a norm with the Royal Society, whose members were obliged to be respectful with each other and never violent in speech or deed. There evolved a style of debate in the Royal Society, Davies says, that was marked by sharp disagreements, but always polite. These modes of etiquette, he says, which have evolved into contemporary norms of scientific speech, serve to keep personal identities and feelings out of the space of disagreement. Throwing them back in, for instance by suggesting an expert is motivated by some personal ambition or grudge, is the main strategy of those wanting to discredit the scientific establishment. He goes on to mention that digital and online media are a gift to those opponents, stretching the ideal of objective criticism to breaking point. Second, a conversation is not just about talking. It is also about listening, and the best conversations are had with those who are close listeners. Today, nobody is really listening, and nobody is really being civil. There exists a fabulous repository of civil discourse, and it is right here with us. When courts deal with deep constitutional issues, they often go back nearly 7 decades to the Constituent Assembly debates. I assure you, on almost any aspect of constitutional law one cares to name, the records of these debates make for the most engaging reading. It is impossible not to come away feeling enriched and rewarded, not only by the quality of thought, but also by the manner of its expression, and the realization that when you dive into the record of these debates, you see dazzling displays of intelligence, insight, foresight, and sagacity. The Constituent Assembly had nearly 300 indirectly elected representatives. It included people from all manner of backgrounds and cultures and political dispositions, from conservative industrialists to Hindu revivalists and radical Marxists. In that composition itself lies a lesson in plurality for us today and what it really means to be broad-based and inclusive. For me, the revelation was that not all, or perhaps not even most of these members had any legal training. In some debates, the members are heard to say so. In others, we hear them speak of having little to no formal education at all. Yet, in discussions on article after article of the draft document, there were amendments proposed and debates had, each reasoned, voiced in measured tones, even when sentiments were strongly held and tempers ran very high. This is the temper of true discourse. The third facet is that a discourse is meaningful only when it has a focus and a starting point. As Davies says, it is impossible to imagine a democracy that doesn't feature disagreement. At the same time, no constitutional settlement can survive if everything is a value judgment or a matter of opinion. There must be some commonly agreed starting point that all are willing to recognize before democratic politics can begin. If therefore we simply say we should have more conversation or that we should have more civil discourse, this is less than helpful. We must know what it is that we are talking about in a civil manner with careful thought and listening, and why. I propose this evening to place before you one area that seems to me to have been almost entirely neglected in our contemporary conversations. I refer to the institutions of a democratic republic and their relationship with government and the people. Let me first say at the beginning that I do not refer to any particular government nor to any particular policy, action or statute. My focus is on the political and legal theory underlying the functioning of institutions in a liberal democracy to show why a certain method of functioning is critical to the maintenance and survival of liberalism in a democratic republic, which is to say, a democracy not governed by the majority or the mob rule, but by the rule of law. Let me explain quickly what I mean by institutions. I do not only mean institutes, and I do not mean any particular organization. The term, at least for this evening, means a set of relatively formalized bodies that function under some statute or enactment with some regulatory oversight. In itself, this is also perhaps too broad. I do not propose this evening to address any aspects relating to the judiciary, the legislatures, or bodies like the Election Commission, the CAG, the Reserve Bank of India, and so on. I believe there are other institutions, which we will now begin to look at illustratively, that are just as important, many of which do not figure very much in our conversations. If they do, it is a momentary expression of being aghast or appalled at some momentary act. I will argue that these institutions and others like them are essential to the survival of a civil society in a constitutional system of governance like ours. I will attempt an explanation of why I strongly believe that it is imperative to accord to these institutions this thing we will now discuss, autonomy. My argument is that autonomy, at least in the understanding of it that I will now present, is not merely desirable. It is fundamental to the preservation and continued existence of a democratic republic under the Constitution and under the rule of law. We must set this discussion in a contextual understanding of the word autonomy. It is widely misunderstood and much given to loose usage nowadays, mostly when talking about colleges and universities. There, autonomy means just being given a slightly longer leash. An autonomous educational institution is not freed from regulation, oversight, affiliation, recognition of the degrees it confers, and so on. It is not even entirely free in the admission process. Its so-called autonomy is restricted usually to course content and design, and perhaps conferring a degree. Is this autonomy? If it is it sufficient? But first, to the word itself. Autonomy is of relatively recent origin and coinage, around the 17th century CE. It is said to be derived from two words in classical Greek, autos for self and nomos for law. It therefore means the right or condition of self-government, independence, and importantly, freedom from external control or influence. In philosophy, particularly Kantian moral philosophy, it speaks to the capacity of an individual to act objectively or to an informed objective standard without being influenced or coerced. For bodies, therefore, it means self-governing or governing independently. It may be contrasted with its exact antonym, heteronomy, specifically acting on another's dictates. But this, though lexically accurate, is only partly useful for our purposes. It is not possible, I believe, to argue that institutional autonomy must mean the complete absence of regulation or oversight. That way lies only chaos and anarchy. It is also illogical, for many of the very institutions in question are themselves creatures of statute. To argue, therefore, that they should be totally free is meaningless. Institutional autonomy for today's purposes is therefore a reference to a concern of broad implication. The reference is not to an operational autonomy, but to a functional and even structural autonomy. It does not mean being anarchically free from oversight, but it does mean not hewing or being compelled to hew to any particular political or social ideology, most especially that of a government in power. This will serve as our working definition. No discussion on institutional autonomy can avoid a reference to what passes for the system of education in this country, particularly post-school. At the broadest level, even the most casual look around suggests that we have utterly lost our way. And education is not just the acquisition of technical skills and proficiency, yet it is to that we have reduced ourselves for the most part. The demands for technical courses grow, while those in academic disciplines shrink. To have a true education is to be steeped in a discipline, and perhaps more importantly, to acquire that elusive ability to constantly teach oneself, to be willing to be forever a student. It is not about copying or learning or applying only that which has been told to us. The perception is that we need more doctors, engineers, accountants, lawyers, but not historians, philosophers, mathematicians, economists, scientists in both the social and physical sciences. Now, couple this perception with that quintessentially Indian horror of money, and you have all the makings of an educational catastrophe. This decline began with the statutory prohibition on this thing called a capitation fee by colleges, particularly medical colleges. It refers to the administrations of these colleges charging an extra premium amount, sometimes disguised as a donation, as a condition to college or university admission and enrollment. Never mind that the terminology is inaccurate, that was our common understanding of it. There is nothing wrong per se with regulating or capping fees or preventing extortionate demands. That is not, however, where we stopped. In the 10 years between 1993 and 2003, the jurisprudential landscape relating to educational admissions went through an enormous metamorphosis. From the first 1993 Unikrishnan case and the 13 orders in the TMA Pai foundation cases, the Supreme Court oversaw the structure of admissions in its entirety, including minorities, affirmative actions, and fees. In 2012, an 11-judge bench of the Supreme Court addressed, among other things, the extent of government regulation of private, professional, educational institutions. One of the matters that came up was the regulation of admissions themselves, seen as an extension of the fee regulatory regime. The court mandated a division between free seats and paid seats, and a common or centralized test, plus the allocation of college seats to students by an external agency. Cardinal to this conceptualization was that a student could not pick her or his college, and the college could not pick its student. The student could specify preferences, but was to be allotted a seat by a nodal agency. The National Eligibility and Entrance Test, or NEET, a successor to the All India Pre-Medical Test, came in 2012. Let me explain how this works. The government decides how many seats a college may have for any particular course. Exactly 15% of these are free for the college to fill in any way it wants, only 15%. One lawyer recently described this to our bench in Bombay as the college's bread and butter. It is more like caviar, but never mind. The remaining 85% is entirely controlled. There is a state level quota from that 85%. Within that, there are affirmative action reservations per class or category, different ones for scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, what are called other backward classes, a truly horrible expression, nomadic tribes, and so on. Within each, there are then some form of regional restrictions. Maharashtra has been divided into 3 such regions for medical admissions. We have Marathwada, Vidarbha, and unbelievably, a region called the rest of Maharashtra. In the constitution, this is supposed to be an administrative division, but it has been engrafted into the college admission structure. An OBC candidate from the Vidarbha region is restricted to colleges in that region. The strangest thing in all this, as I said, is that no college has any say at all in who it will or will not admit or enroll in this 85%. All placements in that percentage are done and only done by some external government-run agency, and there is actually something called a matrix. This is a computer-generated prioritized listing. The student herself or himself has no option to select this or that college. She or he may indicate preferences, but then must accept whatever is allotted and go to that college or lose a year and try again in an exercise known as betterment. If this sounds bizarre, it is, and it has become the victim of unintended consequences. In the last academic year, several thousand seats in Maharashtra went unfilled. All these were in properly affiliated colleges, but all these colleges were outside the major metros. Within the major metropolitan areas, the problem was the reverse, overcrowding. Everyone wanted a college in Mumbai or Pune, and there was at least one case before us where the physical size of the classroom was too small to accommodate a randomly increased intake by the regulator. The increase was for no reason we could tell, with the result that students were standing in the corridors and hallways outside. 3 or 4 such highly fancied colleges went full. Others, because of their geographical locations, ran to empty rooms. This has a downstream effect because if a college does not fill its seat, its next year's intake might be reduced. This control extends to curriculum design too. In another case, there was a problem with one particular course, sculpture. This was not specifically mentioned anywhere, neither in the fine arts nor in the applied arts. And since all these courses are compulsorily approved, regulated, and controlled by an all-India body, some 60-odd aspiring sculptors were left in this sculptural twilight zone, wanting to study it, but unable to do so because it was not recognized or approved. This kind of top-down external structure, re-engineering, undermines educational institutional autonomy in a fundamental way. One can have no argument at all against some level of capping of fees to be charged, as I said, or on a reasonable direct affirmative action scheme. But to allow for this level of regulatory overreach presents another problem, one to which we have shut our eyes. The problem is this. What is being done in these institutes, of which there are vast numbers, is only a skill set training. That freeing and opening of a young student's mind, that expansion of horizons so essential to a true education, are eliminated by removing autonomy from the equation. Contrast this with any educational system in England or America, our 2 most sought after educational destinations, even for those scrambling to get into our professional training institutes. Can you really imagine anyone telling the law, medicine, or engineering schools at Harvard, Stanford, Columbia, Yale, Oxford, or Cambridge that they can have no say in their student admissions, and that who is to be admitted to which school or college will be determined by some state-controlled computer software? As I said, this reduces education to a technical skill acquisition exercise, and it reduces what should be centers of learning and education to little more than coaching classes. The contrast with the few islands of education that remain is startling. There are some that do still provide the true experience of learning and education. The IITs are one example, and they have been outside this deep admission dominance by the government for a long time. There are other examples as well, JNU and other universities here, and to some extent, some colleges and institutions in Bombay. The autonomy, and I speak now of the working definition with which we began, of these and similar institutions makes space for something I believe is integral to any education, to any system of teaching and learning: doubt. In a recent IIT Mumbai case before us, there was a question on a different issue, gender discrimination and harassment. But the backstory was that institute's explicit support for the right to speak freely, to doubt, to question, and to dissent. And that disagreement in the student body was entirely political, rooted in belief, ideology, faith, and an interpretation of secularism and liberty. This in an engineering institute. This commitment to a plurality of voices and space for dissent is crucial to any educational institution. The continuance of this commitment and its ideal, its maintenance and preservation, are tied hand and foot to the right of the institution to take an independent decision, hence autonomy, about the composition of its student body, given certain reasonable requirements. If you take away that right, I would argue, by an external determination of the student body, you take away the space and opportunity for this fundamental construct. Educational institutions throughout history have always been the crucibles and birthplaces of dissent and opposition, spaces for the positioning of countervailing perspectives. We know this since at least the 1960s in the US and possibly even earlier. This is what we mean when we speak of a liberal education. A liberal education does not end with a degree. It sets the tone and stage for a career and a lifelong engagement with new issues as they come up. If a true educational institution is the birthplace of liberal thought, then a life after and outside, and that includes governance, law, and politics, is the battlefield for a continued defense of liberalism. It is for this reason that illiberal governments first target centers of education and learning. They leave the skill set training institutes alone. Those pose no threat. They cannot. But if you want to rid yourself of the troubles of dealing with doubt, dissension, and looking askance in daily governance, in a word, liberalism, it is best nipped in the bud, and what place better to quash it than in its breeding ground, centers of true education. This is the end of liberalism and the beginning of the end of what it means to be a democratic republic. It is also the beginning of something else, and I will come to that very soon. By the way, I wrote this several weeks ago, not yesterday. The most timeless and enduring defense of a liberal education and what it really means goes back to the 9 astonishing lectures delivered in 1852 by John Henry Cardinal Newman to the Roman Catholics of Dublin. Long considered one of the great masters of English prose, Newman's religious journey took him from Anglicanism to the Roman Catholic Church. These 9 discourses have been described as an epoch in the life of every college student. Historians rank it with Aristotle's Ethics as among the most valuable of all works on the aim and purpose of education. Newman's position, beautifully stated, was that a truly liberal education is founded on a knowledge of first principles and relations rather than mere facts. This, he argues, is the idea of a university, the best preparation for any career. Its attributes are freedom, equitableness, calmness, moderation, and wisdom. Liberal knowledge is not just utilitarian knowledge. True knowledge comes from investing facts or mere learning with ideas. A truly educated person is someone who is neither a man of mere information, one who generalizes nothing, nor the merely opinionated man, impatient with facts and therefore unreliable in his assertions. Newman spoke to an ideal, one of a clear, calm, accurate vision, and a comprehension of all things as far as the finite mind can embrace them, something to be achieved by the science of sciences. This is a quotation from the introduction in the University of Notre Dame's 1982 edition of the work. If divided in head and heart and crushed by his vastly multiplied learning, modern man studies or works in universities where specialists in the humanities are cut off not only from those in the sciences but even from one another, and where sometimes it almost appears that every student and every teacher is simply on his own, he might at first be inclined to dismiss an ideal like Newman's as the faded dream of a bygone age. Yet it is a dream that somehow persists, even now, in demanding to be lived. And we have in recent years seen our leading universities making intense efforts to integrate their students' learning so that it does become something like what Newman meant by knowledge. Today's student might well test his own university by asking himself what steps it has taken to encourage him at least to aim at its realization. In places of education and true learning, therefore, autonomy of the kind we define is at its most elemental and precious. Here, in these places, it speaks directly of constitutional values and freedoms. What about other institutions or other types of institutions? Instances abound, as we shall now very quickly see. But even the shortest survey of any of these leads us back to that same nexus between autonomy, dissent, liberalism, democracy, and the rule of law. Take the film certification board, that body we so often wrongly call the censor board. The entirety of the working ethos of this body is rooted in subjectivity. What film should fall into what class is always subjective. Our vocabulary in talking about it is distorted. It is emphatically not a censor board. It has no power to ban. That is a power reserved to government under a different law. It has the power and the duty to certify, and that means to classify. It can refuse to give any certificate at all, but it cannot ban. The Cinematograph Act, 50-year-old act which needs relook, provides general guidance, and there are also some broadly stated guidelines. But too often we see decisions that have no discernible linkage at all to these guidelines. Why have a guideline if one is not going to be guided? This is what prompts courts to interfere and to take over the board's function, because all that appears is quirky subjectivity. This is changing under the stewardship of Justice Sarin, who heads the appellate body. He has called for reasoned decisions, and I can only hope that his push succeeds. But even now, there are multiple instances of unreasoned and unreasonable decisions. The Controlling Act speaks of the opinion of the certifying authority, and then it sets out the yardstick for arriving at this opinion. Against the interests of the sovereignty and integrity of India, the security of the state, friendly relations with foreign states, public order, decency or morality, or involves defamation or contempt of court, or is likely to incite the commission of any offense. The section is intended, obviously, as a solution to this problem of subjectivity. It makes it clear that it is not any old opinion, but one to be reached for these reasons that must inform the certification decision-making process. Of these, the most difficult parameters are decency, morality, and the likelihood of incitement to an offense. In a word, just how much is too much? And what precisely are the qualifications of the certification board's members to take a call for a nation of over 1 billion people when it comes to what is decent or moral? Is showing skin indecent? How much skin? What body parts are we talking about? Is telling of an extramarital relationship immoral? Neither is rare or unknown in real life. Why should real life be the stuff only of candy floss? Life is as often raw, visceral, savage, and barbaric as it is beautiful and full of grace. And let us not forget this. Art imitates life. Therefore, we can no more control an artistic vision than we can control a human being's actions in reality. What the act cautions the body to do is therefore be judicious and circumspect, and most emphatically, not to give vent to personal likes, dislikes, and prejudices. There is a case therefore to be made for less regulation, not more, and to do away with the power to order, that is to command, excisions or cuts in movies. No certification board should, I believe, ever indicate what should be cut. Why a director or author decides to portray something in a particular fashion is a question of a highly individualized artistic sensibility. Consider this. A close-up in a movie of a hand holding a cutthroat razor, slitting the held open eye of an animal, or is it a woman, and vitreous fluid spilling out. There is no plot to this work. Would we order a cut? Why? This is from one of the classics of world cinema, Louis Buñuel's Un Chien Andalou. Another example. A woman is gang raped. To keep her from revealing the identity of her assailants, they cut out her tongue and lop off her hands, replacing them with tree branches. When she is rescued and her rescuer begs her to reveal the identity of her attackers, she leans towards the camera and opens her bloodied mouth in a silent scream. Later in this very work, a king is asked whether a father should kill his daughter if she has been raped. The king agrees and says yes, she should. And the father snaps his raped and dismembered daughter's neck. What would we do with a work like this? Would we pause and ask ourselves if this is art or literature or merely gruesome and unnecessary bloodletting and mindless violence? The film is by Julie Taymor, her directorial debut. It features Anthony Hopkins and Jessica Lange. It is called Titus, and it is an adaptation of a work called Titus Andronicus, written by William Shakespeare. Would that make us change our mind? For the Film Certification Board, therefore, we have twin demands. A narrow tailoring of what it can and cannot do, and given that, a functional autonomy. A too amorphous latitude in the first leads to unacceptable subjectivity, and a lack of autonomy, the second part, brings us to unacceptable intrusions into artistic freedom. Again, to illiberalism and the stifling of dissent. When such autonomy is compromised by a real or perceived, externally imposed or self-imposed, adherence to what might or might not be palatable to those currently in power or to a particular political ideology, we are then headed in exactly the opposite direction from our constitutional mandate. We then have all the trappings of a fascist state. Authoritarianism can take different forms. It is most visible when imposed top-down, as we can so often see in brutal regimes. But the other way of undermining a society predicated on individual liberty is to eviscerate public institutions from the inside out. One way of doing this is, naturally, to compromise their independence in decision-making, that is to say, their autonomy. Jason Stanley's book, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, is a superb and eminently readable analysis of the methods of this dismantling. Fascist states focus on dismantling the rule of law and replacing it with the dictates of individual rulers or party bosses, and incidentally, an independent judiciary is a favorite target. Tyranny, Stanley explains, referencing Socrates' argument in Book 8 of Plato's Republic, is often the result of a strong man seizing democracy's commitment to liberty and speech and using it against itself to consolidate his position and undermine democracy itself. The essence of fascism is its rejection of pluralism and tolerance. These are very real perils for any government. I would argue that any government, either explicitly or implicitly, demands this sort of fidelity is a government that before long is doomed to catastrophic collapse and oblivion. A liberal democracy founded on a constitutional precept is not just a concept. It is, as Tom Ginsburg and Aziz Haq say in How to Save a Constitutional Democracy, a matter of daily practice. This practice depends on a degree of institutional differentiation. The doctrine of powers, separation of powers, we all know, is one dimension of this. But it also depends on key institutions that are born from constitutional ideals and are to be informed by those ideals, remaining autonomous and true to the intent of their governing statutes, not to a malleable, immediate political expediency. Many of the most egregious transgressions of liberties come not from the leaders themselves, but from civil servants and bureaucrats tasked with policy implementation or governing this or that institutional body. Parallel to the Film Certification Board are our state-controlled cultural and art institutions. For the same reasons, they too must be allowed to function autonomously in service of their primary purposes. All art is political, and art is nothing if not discourse and dissent. If it is not that, it is just so much pap. The purpose of art in every form is to question, to doubt, to look askance, to disagree, and to present an alternative perspective. In a finely realized address in Mumbai recently at a literary event, reviewing the purpose of different art forms and their relation to freedom, liberal democratic ideals, and constitutional values, Justice Chandrachud said that the libertarian idea of constitutional law wants all individuals to be autonomous and rational. Yet individual autonomy is fragile. Institutional autonomy needs to be made of stronger stuff. Conformity to a political or socio-ethnic ideology takes away dissent, and by prohibiting it in a designated art space, takes away the physical space for dissent. It must, I argue, be open to the director of a museum or an art institute to insist that an art or his work has value and meaning, even if it is directly opposed to or even questions or taunts a particular ideology or stated political intent. In India, this is perhaps much more important than we realize or acknowledge for one overarching reason. The single largest patron of the arts in India is the government. We do not have the kind of mammoth endowments that museums and art centers, especially in America, do. But a lack of financial autonomy must not ever be allowed to translate into a stripping of functional autonomy. If we permit that, we suppress and subjugate art. If we do that to prevent the articulation of an opposing or countervailing narrative or perspective, then we drive ourselves away from our stated constitutional ideals to a place of illiberal conformity. Here is my real problem with conformity and illiberalism. It is unspeakably boring. It is a land of pretty pictures, but nothing that will challenge, question, doubt, or disturb. Illiberalism speaks to a fulfillment of predictability, of only presenting the already known. Liberalism is about anticipation and the exhilaration of uncertainty, of not knowing what lies ahead. As Julian Barnes wrote so brilliantly in Flaubert's Parrot, the greatest pleasure in life is the pleasure of anticipation. Who needs to burst into fulfillment's desolate attic? There is one other institution to which I must make reference, and again, this is something I wrote 3 weeks ago. It is the statutory body constituted under the Right to Information Act. It seems to me utterly illogical and absurd that this body should be anything but autonomous, and possibly the most autonomous of all. Its primary target in its statutorily mandated work is the government itself. To alter its composition and curtail its remit so it serves the government rather than the people for whom it was meant is an unspeakable travesty. This approach is another inside-out damaging of institutional autonomy, and it achieves an authoritarian purpose while damaging the fabric of a liberal democracy. The right to know is a game changer, like the Right to Education Act, and it is a powerful check on government excess. To be sure, the Act can be abused, but the fact that a statute can be abused is only a call for a judicious approach in dealing with such attempted abuse, not a reason to jettison the rationale of the statute altogether. My argument today is that a government, any government, that claims to be dedicated to the Constitution, to democracy, and to liberalism has nothing at all to fear from according a wide functional autonomy to its institutions and their processes. The future of such a government is all but assured. Ideas are bulletproof. Dissent is what dissent does, and it takes no defined form and is therefore impossible to stamp out. A government that instead demands or even expects ideological conformity from its key institutions and thereby shrinks the space for dissent is an illiberal and undemocratic government that acts contrary to a fundamental tenet of our constitutionalism. Any government that demands such ideological conformity hunts the snark. It is a venture doomed to failure. Again, as I said at the beginning, this is not about any particular government or even any particular ideology, let alone any specific state action or enactment. It is about the need to engage with the theoretical underpinning of the importance of dissent and dissension in a liberal democracy, constitutionally required to be always subject to and under the rule of law. There are therefore the conflicting choices before us today. To one side is the perceived political threat that all dissent poses, whatever its form. On the other is the peril of a loss of liberalism, freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. Scylla and Charybdis were two mythical sea monsters from Greek mythology. They lay on either side of the narrow Strait of Messina between Sicily and Calabria. Scylla was a six-headed monster, or sometimes called a rock shoal, on the mainland, the Calabrian side. Charybdis was a horrific whirlpool off the coast of Sicily. Between them, they posed an inescapable threat to voyagers. Heroes from classical Greek mythology, including Odysseus and Jason, had to pass between these two perils. So do we today. Homer says Odysseus was advised to sail closer to Scylla, thus risking the loss of maybe a few sailors, rather than moving towards Charybdis and risk losing the whole ship. That is also our choice today. And the choice we make will determine not just our nation's future, but its survival. Thank you all again for being here and for your patience.